to Voices in the Wilderness. I am Bishop Lorraine Bouffard of Connecticut Diocese, the American Ecumenical Catholic Church. Before I begin and introduce my very special guests and two co-hosts, I would like to thank Hartford Seminary, where I am an alum, for providing me the opportunity to be here today to do this interview. My guest is the retired Bishop of the Diocese of Newark, New Jersey, Bishop John Spong. Welcome.
Thank you.
And my two co-hosts are Father Chris Rose and Reverend Pat Gallagher. Thank you both for coming. Bishop Spong, you've written so many books. I have some of them in the back there that if I were to list all of them, the show would be over. So I'm just going to say that I want to thank you for writing what you have written, because you have articulated for so many of us problems that we have had with doctrine and dogma, that to us, some of which are irrational, and some of them are totally irrelevant to being a Christian disciple. What I'd like to do is have you speak right at the outset about this person, Bishop Robinson, who wrote this book called Honest to God. I understand that he was very important in your life. So could you say a little bit about him?
I've had three great mentors in my life, and John was one of the three. He burst upon the scene in the United Kingdom in the late 50s in a debate over sexuality. He championed the right for the publication of the book Lady Chatterton's Lover, when the people who wanted to suppress that book in England not allowed to be published. He did it in the name of free speech, but of course he was interpreted to be supporting immorality, since that story is about adultery. And people knew that this was a young bishop who wasn't going to stay in the bounds in that moment, so the press began to hone in on him. The press in England loves a bishop that sort of doesn't stay within the bounds. And his doctor, he had a back problem. His doctor told him the only thing, he had a choice of surgery or 6 months of bed rest, and he opted for 6 months of bed rest. And that shut his body down, didn't shut his mind down, and that's when this book was written. I mean, he must have just sort of poured this book out. When you read it, it's a great book. It's not a profound book. It's a great book, but it's hot, journalistic style press. It's roaring out of this man's mind. And what he did in that book was to introduce the world at large to three seminal Christian thinkers that were known, familiar people in the seminaries and theological academies, but they weren't known by the people in the street. And that was Rudolf Bultmann, who was probably the best New Testament scholar in the 20th century, certainly the most provocative New Testament scholar, who gave us the word demythologism. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was the German martyr, who was executed by the Nazis at Flossenburg in 1945, just before the Allied armies freed that prison camp. And Bonhoeffer gave us the word religionless Christianity, which is a really tantalizing sort of phrase. And then the third one was Paul Tillich, who was my great teacher. And Paul Tillich gave us a definition of God that was non-personal, called God the ground of all being. And what John did was try to take the ferment from these three seminal thinkers and put it together as a specific challenge to, not to Christianity, but to the way Christianity was articulated at that time. It created enormous controversy. The book sold more copies than any religious book since Pilgrim's Progress. It's translated to every language in the world. It was just recently republished in America with a new foreword by David John Hall and by Rose and Rev, just out really within the last few days. He became my friend. I met him first in 1973. I read his book, but not until 2 years after it was passed, and I looked upon it with great disdain. And after all, I knew Bonhoeffer, Bultmann, and Tillich. I didn't have to have regurgitated Bonhoeffer, Bultmann, and Tillich. So I reacted the way the religious establishment, nothing new here. And yet I never could forget this book, because I kept going back to it and saying, you know, what he really did was let the cat out of the bag. You can't say the same words, because my consciousness is now raised on this issue. So the book was terribly influential in my life, and I read it in 1966, and I read it in 1965, and I started a new parish, and I decided I'd never again say something that I didn't deeply and honestly believe. That's what my response was. So I began to move in that direction. I met him in '73, and I had just written my first book at that point, which was which is named after his book. My book is called Honest Prayer. It's a long prayer. But it was my attempt to deal with prayer in a whole new setting as he had developed it in one chapter in this book. And from that moment on, I was sort of moving in that direction. I met him the second time. I gave him my book in 1973 and told him what he had meant to me, and it was a minute and a half exchange. I remember it. I'm quite sure he didn't. In 1978, 5 years later, we were both in different places. I was now the Bishop of Newark, and he was a dean of the chapel in Clare College in Cambridge. He had ceased being a bishop. The issue ceased. He had resigned from the bishop, going back to teach in Cambridge. And the church in England was trying to make peace with John Robinson, whom they had marginalized and treated shamefully. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury invited John to be a theological consultant to the Lambeth Conference, and I was there as probably the youngest bishop there, maybe 45 years old at that point. And I happened to hook up with him again. Of all the experiences I've had in my life, Lambeth was probably the most boring. It's hundreds of bishops preaching last Sunday's sermon under the guise of engaging in discussion. And it was almost more than I could tolerate, and it was more than John could tolerate. So we sort of hooked up. I don't remember how we sort of became aware of each other's frustrations, but we hooked up and we decided that we'd skip out on all those discussions. And so we took walks every afternoon through the woods of Kent. And we discussed the New Testament, and we developed
let me ask you
friendship.
about the New Testament. Would you say, what book would you say put you in the camp of being a heretic, or called a heretic, or called truly a non-believer? Because in the likes of Robinson, who was thought to be not a Christian, what book kind of gelled that for you too with the public?
What book of the Bible?
No, what book of yours? What book of yours?
I don't think it came that way. Well, maybe it did. My second book was called This Hebrew Lord, which was an attempt to put Jesus into a Jewish setting and let that setting illumine him. A rabbi in Richmond was at a cocktail party with some Gentile friends and saw this book called This Hebrew Lord on the cocktail table, on the coffee table, and borrowed it. I accused him never of having bought it yet. He borrowed it, took it home and read it, and he called me up and he said, "Mr. Spong, I know him from Adam. I just read your book, This Hebrew Lord, and I've never read a book by a Christian that paid such homage to Jews. And of course I disagree with you." And I said, "Well, of course you do. If you agreed with me, you'd have to be baptized. There's very little market for baptized rabbis in this book." He said, "I'd like to debate your book with me in front of my synagogue." And I said, "I'd be so delighted to do that." So we met for a debate, and the debate wound up in an 8-week dialogue. It was in my attempt to explain Christology to a Jewish audience that I became known as controversial. Because the Jews have such a concept of God's otherness and God's holiness that the idea that God could become human was just an anathema idea. But they also had, in the Jewish tradition, some interesting words like Mashiach, which we translate Messiah and later translate Christos or Christ. But Mashiach in its original setting was a name for the king. But then after the king disappeared, after the exile, there was no more king, it sort of entered into mythology. And then Mashiach was any life through which the will of God was lived out, and any life in whom the word of God was heard. So the Jews even called Cyrus, the king of the Persians, God's Messiah, God's Mashiach, God's Christ, if you will, because they saw in Cyrus God allowing the chosen people to go back to their home. They saw God working through the life. So Cyrus was the light in whom the will of God was being worked out. So those were the words I took to speak to a Jewish audience, to try to say that that's how we understand the relationship between God and Jesus. And the headline the next day in the Richmond paper, reporters not necessarily theologically astute, said, "Jesus was not God, Rector asserts." Well, in some sense, I think I would say that, but I